Before I wrote fantasy titles like those in the ISIS series and fantasy novels like The Temptation of John Haynes, I read a lot of comic books. And some of my favorite comic books were those that were part of the Milestone line. These included Hardware, the Blood Syndicate, Icon, and Static. Milestone Media was a comic book company that launched its initial line back in 1993 when I was in college. And they were the first publisher to feature an entire line and an entire universe filled with African American superheroes. That was one of the things that really got me excited about buying these comics, because as I've been a lifelong comic fan, and most of the times the superheroes in comics are usually just white guys or white women. But when it came down to Milestone, we had an entire universe that centered around African American characters, and in some cases multicultural characters, and we saw things from an African American perspective. Milestone was founded primarily by the late great Dwayne McDuffie, and had artists like Dennis Cowan and Mark D. Bright and other African American and Hispanic artists working there. It was predominantly African American owned and controlled comic book company, and that's what made it so unique, that we had African American creators making characters, telling their own stories, and telling them from their own perspective. And that's what really got me, back when I was in college, really excited about buying these comics on the regular. Milestone Comics, they produced some of the best representations of African Americans I have seen in my entire life. Many of the images inside of a Milestone comic were some of the most balanced when it came down to African American heroes. You also got to see a large, broad perspective of African American heroes. You got to see, for example, with Hardware, you got to see an educated black man working at a business. That's what you got to see with Hardware. With the Blood Syndicate, we got to see grim and gritty heroes in a street gang. So we got to see them. With Icon, we got to see a more conservative type hero who represented a bit more of a conservative viewpoint. And with Static, we got to see a African American teenager. Before we got this array of images. Usually when companies like Marvel and DC, which are pretty much controlled by white people, we usually got to see your usual ancillary type image of an African American. And usually because it's created from a white guy's perspective, it often fell into the range of stereotype. For example, like your Luke Cage. Now, I love the Luke Cage character, and for his time, he was, pretty much unique. But oftentimes, the Cage character falls into stereotypes, and it keeps him from becoming as multidimensional as he was. But I really love this character, but he didn't really, have that balanced image like the Milestone characters. The Milestone characters were unique in that they presented you with that, unique image of African Americans, and it presented you, with a spectrum of images of African Americans. You saw people from all walks of life, being heroes. Just like I said before, Hardware, who was the gifted inventor, he was like the Tony Stark of that universe. The Blood Syndicate, yes, they were gang members, but they all, fought the bad guys in their own way. You had Icon, who really gave you a historical perspective of African Americans from slavery to now, and how this guy who was a brother from another planet, how he represented being a hero in his own way. And then you had Static, who was like the Spider-Man. He was like the black teenager, and he gave us a picture of being a hero from the black teen perspective. And I loved seeing all these different pictures and all these different images and all these different walks of life, because a lot of people never understand that there is more than one shade of brown, and that there's a whole different whole bunch of shades and textures to being black. And that was one of the great things that I enjoyed seeing, regarding the Milestone line. They always showed you, different experiences, different viewpoints, and we got, one of the most balanced pictures of African Americans in comics from the Milestone line. They gave us, one of the most balanced pictures. I mean, we saw all sorts of heroes, all sorts of people from different walks of life, all sorts of different experiences, and that gave people that broader perspective on what it meant to be an African American hero. Um, like I said before, in the past we only got snippets here and there. I mean, for your Luke Cages and your Black Panthers and your Falcons, and in the '80s Jim Rose when he put on the Iron Man suit, we really didn't really get that much of a picture. We got an all right picture, but it wasn't as balanced and as the Milestone picture was. The Milestone picture, I say, was one of the most balanced I ever saw. I mean, we again got all those different shades and textures of black that I did not see previously. And I've been collecting comics again since I was about. I've been a fan of comics since I was 4 years old, and I've been collecting since I was about 14 years old, and that was back in the '80s. And we really didn't get to see that. Um, what we had before, again, we had a nice little run of Jim Rhodes' Iron Man. That was all right, but when I look at a lot of those issues nowadays, I go, "That's scared brother." Cyborg was very nice. He was one of the best images of a black superhero. His stands the test of time in the New Teen Titans. Luke Cage, he kind of disappeared right after around 1984 after they said he murdered Iron Fist in the last issue. So it was very hard to get to see, pictures of African American heroes. So the Milestone line, it was something that, when I heard it came out, I just said I had to buy it. And I pretty much, I bought almost every issue up until I graduated college in about 95, and not 95, but late August 1994. And I just ran out of money because I had to start going to look for job searches. So I didn't have money for comics, but I made it an effort, to go out and buy these comics because I said, these are the type of images that I wanted to produce when I started, writing stories. I originally, back in '94, I submitted a resume and a cover letter to Milestone Media, but they never got back to me. I've always wanted to write. This is the type of work that I wanted to write, and this is the type of stories I wanted to tell. And these books were a major influence on my writing. A lot of people, they don't know that, Icon was a major influence on me writing the ISIS character, because the ISIS character, when I came up with it, she's supposed to be, the youngest of the gods, and she's supposed to be, about under 2,000 years old. So in the first ISIS book, this is where I got the idea for her running into white supremacy and racism, and showing it from that female perspective, because I said, Icon showed it from the male perspective, and when I wrote, the first ISIS book, I wanted to show, how black women dealt with it, and how black women dealt with things from the female perspective, and that was one of the reasons, one of the influences on it. That, and there were two other comic concepts that were influenced on ISIS. One was Mark Waid and Alex Ross's Kingdom Come. That's where I got the idea for it being about old gods, and Batman Beyond, which was about, gods in the future. And that's that. But Icon was the core of it, because Icon inspired me to think about, that black history component, and how this goddess would deal with white supremacy and racism. And I wanted to, get a little bit more in depth. And because Icon talks about it for a bit, but when I was doing ISIS, I really wanted to really get in depth with it so people could understand what people dealt with at that time. And I also wanted to, talk about other parts of the history, because I really love this Icon series. This was one of my, favorite comics, because it showed you that, African American history through this brother from another planet. He's showing you, what our history was from a different perspective, and that's what really, was a major influence on me. But these heroes really were a major influence on my writing, and seeing these heroes, really inspired me to get to the keyboard and start, creating characters and, really start telling stories. This, because the 90s were like a golden age, for African Americans on a creative standpoint. We had Milestone Media, we had Gargoyles, which had Keith David and Sally Richardson in lead. We had two black actors in a lead role in a Disney production, and that was another thing that influenced me, because that's where I got the idea for the Eastine character from watching Sally Richardson's portrayal, and I later on used Keith David for the Lucifer character. But it was a golden age. You had Mantis on the air. There were a lot of black images out there, and they were balanced. They were unique, and they presented that spectrum of African American images. And again, yes, they influenced me tremendously. That was because my mission at 17 years old was I wanted to create those positive stories about the African American experience. I wanted to, continue telling those stories, and I wanted to build, on the legacies of people like your Bill Cosbys and the late great Dwayne McDuffie, and many of these people who wanted to create, images that were positive and told our stories. That was one of the major influences, on me as a writer. I really wanted, to pick up the baton from these people and continue to run the race when they couldn't run it. That was one of the things that, makes me passionate about, publishing this SJS direct imprint. And a lot of people will say, oh, Milestone went out of business. Milestone, as I've seen it, was a tremendous success because we never saw African American characters this way. We never got to see stories told this way. And we never got to see a group of black men, come together to create and tell, stories from our perspective. Oftentimes, when it came down to black comics before Milestone, they were often, written by white men. And the few black writers that were in the industry, like your Christopher Priest, they didn't really have a lot of influence. So they were stuck writing white heroes. They couldn't really create. Guys like Dwayne McDuffie and Christopher Priest, they couldn't really get creative like they did at Milestone Media. At Milestone Media, they were able to write their own characters, create their own characters, and, tell stories from the African American experience. That's what made that company special. And I really wish, 20 years ago, I could have been a part of that. I really, really wish I could have learned from those guys. I think I could have learned a lot from them. But unfortunately, I could not, be a part of it. But I want to really, pick up that baton and, continue to carry the race. That's something I really want to do with this SJS Direct imprint is, pick up where they left off and, continue to try to run that race. But these comics were a major influence on me, and they had a lot of positive impact on people around them. I mean, I remember, seeing them on this vendor's shelf on Fordham Road, and I just got so excited. I just said, I just have to buy these. And, it just meant a lot to me to buy them because it's very rare that for me to see, heroes that look like myself. I mean, the last time I saw, heroes that looked like me was in New Teen Titans. And that was back in the 80s, and that was the only time you saw like one guy like Cyborg or something like that, but they never carried their own books. In the case of Milestone Media, the heroes were carrying their own books, they were telling their own stories, they were having their own adventures, and it was really a unique universe. And, a lot of people, they didn't appreciate, how great these books were then, and some people still don't appreciate them. I remember when I brought the comics home, my brother, who got me influenced into comics, he thought that they were, exploitation and degradation of black people. He didn't understand, what these books represent. Now, me owning them 20 years later and, seeing how things have changed regarding the image of African Americans, I have come to, appreciate how great these books are and, how much value they have, to me in my life. I mean, reading stuff like this, especially if you were a little kid and you grew up, seeing African American superheroes, that really has a positive impact on you, because you're seeing someone like yourself, in a superhero role, and then you start, that really shapes your perception of self. I mean, I remember sharing these comics with my cousin, when we were living together. He really enjoyed these comics. He really enjoyed reading them. I would let him sit down and read through them. I didn't really care about super mint condition. What meant a lot to me was passing down the tradition like my brother had with me, and showing him that not just superheroes, but showing him that you can be a hero too, and that there are people like you that can be heroes. And that was really was very important to me. He really enjoyed reading the Milestone comics, and I really enjoyed sharing the Milestone comics with him, because I really like seeing characters that look like me, and characters that look like me telling stories, and having adventures. That's one of the reasons why I dedicated myself to becoming a writer, and that's one of the reasons why I dedicated myself to publishing stories in the SJS Direct Imprint. Again, I always wanted to write comics, but unfortunately, I wasn't able to get in the industry because around '93, at the time, Milestone was just getting started. The industry collapsed due to this, all of the speculator boom, and because of the speculator boom, a lot of great comics. A lot of people didn't read a lot of great comics because a lot of people were coming into the industry, looking for a fast payday, and a lot of great comics, didn't get picked up. And when the case of Milestone, it was like, a lot of people missed out on a lot of great comics because a lot of people were coming in thinking that, the value of these books is, the price. I apologize for the interruption. I had to get the doorbell. But Milestone Media, in spite of the coming in on the cusp of the speculator collapse, was a tremendously successful comic book company. And their success was they were able to launch 4 regular monthly series, and then 1994, then expand to a couple of newer titles after the first big storyline, which was the Shadow War. And the Shadow War concluded with the Shadow Cabinet number 0, which is this book which I'm holding right here. And during that time, they also launched the Zombie series, which had a nice little revival at DC Comics a couple of years ago. John Rossum's, created this character, and he brought it back for a nice little critically acclaimed run. I suggest you go out and get those. And they also launched another series, Cobalt. This one kind of reminds me of The Tick and a little bit of Batman. So this one is a lot of fun to read. And in the series, they have a nice little static team up with Cobalt's sidekick, Paige. And in addition to that, they had 3 major events. The first was the Shadow War. This was the first big event. They had Worlds Collide, where the Milestone heroes met Superman and people of the Superman family, such as Steel and Superboy. And this was a big event. And that also came up with a big event comic. This one is the Worlds Collide special, and this comic has a great little gimmick. On one side, in the bag, they gave you a whole bunch of stickers, and you could make your own cover by using the stickers. I've had this for about 20 years. I don't know if these still stick anymore, but this was part of the gimmick that they gave you they gave you a cover, and you could put the Milestone heroes and the DC heroes on the cover with these stickers, and this was a fun little gimmick. With Milestone's success, they also were able to get big time artists to do covers for them. Like this one was done by John Byrne. This was done by Walt Simonson. And they all did a series of covers. I mean, this one was also done by Walt Simonson. So, this one was done by Byrne. This is the start of the Zombie series. This is done with a Byrne. This is a Byrne cover, and they were able to get a lot of great talent to work with them. and that's a lot. I mean, they produced over, I'd say about 400 comics in the short time that they were in publication, and that's a tremendous feat. I mean, I look at that, and that again, that's a tremendous feat for any publisher because, when I first started SJS Direct, I was just publishing, one book a year, and that takes a lot of work to do just to publish one book a year, and then, I started expanding to the point where in 2013 I was doing 13 books a year, and for them to, produce 4 books a month and then expand to 7 and then do 3 major events. The first was the Shadow War. The second one, which was the Worlds Collide, where the Milestone heroes meet the DC heroes, and the third one, which was the Long Hot Summer. That's a tremendous accomplishment, and that's a major success, for a publisher to do that in such a short period of time, to establish a universe of characters, to establish, this universe of characters, and then to expand upon it in such a short period of time. That's a major accomplishment. And to say that this group of African American comic creators, you know, did this at a time when the industry was starting to contract, and then still, have this legacy that many people still today, can go back and reach back to, that says a lot. And then to say that, 6 years after even the end of Milestone Media, they were able to take one of their top characters, Static, and put him into a television show, which eventually became the #1 cartoon on Kids WB for some time, with no merchandising and no licensing. That's another, testament to how strong these characters are. And the Milestone characters, they had a profound, impact. Um, and the company was a tremendous success. Yes, it didn't last that long, but in the short time that they were there, they were able to have, a lasting impact on people. And I look at, this company and the books that they produced. This is what, I want to what I wanted to see on a regular basis. And I wish they had stayed in business because I would have loved to have been a part of the Milestone family, and to have made a contribution, because I look at Milestone Media, and there was there was plenty of room for expansion. I always looked at it and said, you know, there was a good chance for them, to introduce, something like that black female superhero, and that was something that if I had gotten a chance to, work for them, that's probably would have one of the things I would have wanted to contribute. Um, because I look at, how I have the ISIS series has a, fairly, it's a small following, but it's starting to build, and I think, with the right distributors, maybe, and she could have, the character could have, gained an even bigger following, if I was to work with a comic book company like that. But when it comes down to when I look at it, the impact of Milestone Media, especially on myself, it was a major inspiration for me in becoming a writer, and creating characters, and eventually creating the SJS Direct Imprint. A lot of the concepts and ideas that they had, regarding diversity, and showing all the unique aspects of life, all the different textures and shades of blackness, I still apply a lot of those approaches to my own publications. I just don't, I always believe that there is more than one shade of black, more than one black experience, and more than one story. And I try to tell different stories, and that's why, I'll do stories in African American fantasy, like the ISIS series, and then I'll do, a story like Temptation of John Haynes, and the Yeast Team series, and then I'll explore other cultures that other people haven't explored, like what I'm doing with this new novel, Spinsterella. This is a novel which features an African American goth character, and explores, African American goth subculture. And that was one of the another thing that really, was a major inspiration for me from Milestone Comics, is that I learned to, explore other aspects of African American culture that, most people wouldn't, in the black community, wouldn't, take a long, serious look at. Most people don't even know that black goths exist. And, I just did a Google search and I found, quite a few of them. I found their pages, I found their videos, and I want people to know, that there are people in the African American community who are participating in this subculture. And I wanted to tell that story. And that was one of the, that's one of the things that I got, from my lessons of reading Milestone Comics, is, just to start looking outside of the box, at what African American culture is, and, to see it from a broader perspective, and to see a bigger picture. Because when it comes down to African American culture, um, we barely scratch the surface on it in most media, in comics, television, movies, um, even stage plays. It barely scratches the surface. And if we even dug just, an iota deeper, we would get, a completely different picture. Because when I was growing up, the pictures that I saw of African Americans, it was a very broad picture. And over the last 15 years, it's gotten narrower and narrower. And now, instead of us getting those multiple stories like we did in a Milestone Media, we're getting just a handful of stories that fit, one narrative. And I really wish we could go back to, the 90s, because it was late 80s, early 90s, because that was like a golden age where we were seeing, all these different stories, all these different experiences, and, everybody, had different tales to tell. I mean, that's where I saw things, like not just black fantasy, but black horror, black science fiction, and it just ran the gambit, and we saw, a complete range of tales. And I know I'm getting a little off the track here, but this is what I saw. And when I look at Milestone Comics and the impact that it had, you know, that's what I want to, build on that legacy and build on that foundation, continuing to create those African American heroes and African American heroines, and, creating those positive stories. Because I look at the work that these guys did, and, that laid a very strong foundation. I just would like to, continue building on it in my own way. Um, again, I always wanted to do comics, but unfortunately, because the industry fell apart, I wound up doing young adult fiction, and I'm still, I take these comics to heart. Um, I take the things that I read in them, and I take the lessons I learned about, Milestone's business, and I try to, expand upon it in my own career. And I really, I really look at these comics, and they are, they're great comics, and everything that they did, was a major influence on me. The whole idea of seeing, black men making their own comics, writing their own comics, drawing their own comics, and publishing their own comics, you know, that made me believe that it was possible for myself to, become that type of entrepreneur, and, start that type of business. Because yes, there were a lot of independent black publishers making black superheroes like your Captain Africa and other books, but they never, became serialized, and they never, really got that strong distribution or that strong press like Milestone did. Milestone was the first comic company, black owned, to get, major press, major distribution, and, you know, get access to the comic readers in the comic shops, the bodegas, and the newspaper stores. Back in the day, they were able to access the marketplace for the first time. A lot of people said that they didn't know, how to market these comics, but, you know, they didn't need, special marketing. Nobody needed to see them as, the black superheroes. What they were great characters based on the content of their character. I mean, when I looked at Milestone Comics and I saw that they were black heroes, that was one thing that got me, to pick up the first issue, but what kept me collecting was the great writing, the great storytelling, and the great character development. That and also, you know, the great art. And because the comics were compelling, that's what kept me buying the comics. And that's all you need to do with marketing, because what I find um, with one moment ISIS series books, this is I have no problem marketing this character to African Americans, whites, Asians, Hispanics, and people all over the world. People like this character, and I have no problem marketing this character in, you know, all over the world. Same thing with this book, The Temptation of John Hayes. I have no problem marketing and selling this book um, to people all over the world, and it's just not a problem because there's no need for special marketing or special placement. A good character is going to, you know, find readers, and readers are going to find them. And that's the same thing with Milestone. It didn't need fancy marketing or anything like that. These were great characters, and the reason why people connected with them is because they identified with them, they identified with their experiences, and they identified with the stories that the writers and the artists told in their comics. They related to them. And when you have a good character, people, you know, they're going to find it. And I've had, you know, people find my African American characters, again, all over the world. I mean, I can point to um, this character, all about Nikki Desmond and All About Nikki. This character is an African American character, and she's also very popular all over the world. I have no problem selling this character. So I guess either a lot has changed in 20 years, or I've, you know, found ways to break into markets that I have no idea, that I never knew. But when I look at the Milestone and how some people said that the books were hard to place and hard to sell, you know, I have no problem, again, selling, you know, books like You're All About Nikki, or Your Temptation of John Haynes, or your ISIS series, you know, to readers all over the world. People find these characters and they read them. A lot of the people know that the characters are black, and they don't care. They just like the stories, they like the character development, and that was one of the lessons, you know, I picked up from Milestone Comics, just to write good characters and, you know, good multidimensional characters. And yes, they're African American, but as you're reading them, what you will find is that, you know, you reach a point where you start connecting with them as people, um, beyond the skin tone. And that's, you know, one of the positives that I got, you know, reading Milestone Comics. I looked past, you know, the surface of the character skin tone and looked at the content of the characters. And it's those internal character traits that really, you know, kept me buying these comics on a regular basis. I wanted to see, you know, this company grow, and I wanted to see this company thrive. And and I always thought, you know, if it had stayed in business, I would have loved to work at this company and, you know, contributed in some way. Again, there were some things that, you know, some areas I believe I could have, you know, provided a contribution to, because I always felt that they needed that series, solo series with an African American female, um, because you need that balance. I mean, yeah, you had 4 books with African American males, but Milestone really needed a book with an African American female, and to show an African American female experience. That was a book that they really needed, because, you know, one of the big markets is in publishing is African American women, and if you can get them hooked into a good story, you pretty much have your sales right there. And that was one of the things I thought they should have done. I mean, I always thought that, you know, they had a great character in Rocket, but when they made her a single mother, they pretty much, you know, derailed that character and derailed the series to a point. And they really needed to have that African American female character, you know, in the mix. But that's my opinion. The company, again, was great. Um, and a lot of the products they produced were some of the best comics, I'd say, you know, produced in the 90s. I mean, when you look at Milestone's legacy and you look at its contribution to the comic book industry, It is tremendous, and it was a major inspiration and a major influence on me in my quest to become a writer. I originally wanted to write comics, and if the industry hadn't collapsed, I would probably be writing comics right now. But right now, I'm applying a lot of what I learned from Milestone Media and Milestone Comics in books like the ISIS series, The Temptation of John Haynes, and the upcoming Temptation of John Haynes sequel, um, and even screenplay comedy books like All About Nikki. I still apply much of what I read and much of what I learned in these books. Sometimes I even mention Milestone Comics in these books. In All About Nikki season 2, I mention most of the Milestone books and reference them. Um, I'm still waiting for the Static Shock series to come on DVD. Um, one of these days, because I have them all on VHS. That's how big a fan I am of these characters. That's how big a fan I am, of these comics. I still have, as you see, most of the comics are still in their Mylar bags, and I still try to keep them in fairly decent condition because I like to go back to them and read them. And I really appreciate, everything that the late great Dwayne McDuffie, Dennis Cowan, and Mark Bright, and many others did in starting this line. And again, if it wasn't for these guys, creating these comics, I probably would not have the, background information to start the SJS Direct imprint, or get many of the ideas and inspirations for characters like ISIS. I mean, when it came down to ISIS, part of the parts with the Black history related to it, that came from what I read in the Icon comic book. So this company has a major connection to me and a major connection to my work. So it really means a lot to me, to try to pick up this baton and continue this race, and continue to promote and push those positive images of African Americans, giving and the African American experience, and telling all those unique stories about the African American experience. Um, One of these days, I hope to do an ISIS comic book or an ISIS graphic novel, and I hope to apply much of what I learned, again, from reading all these great Milestone comics. It's one of those cornerstones of the body of my work. It's one of those things that influenced me tremendously, and I really wanted to, let people know what the Milestone Media comics and the Milestone Heroes really meant to me. That's all I have to say for this video. You can get many of the Milestone comics at your local comic shop, in the back issues box, or at the cons. Many of them, I believe, are still somewhat affordable, maybe in the $3 to $5 range mint condition, or you can pick up a couple of them on eBay. But they are so worth more than the price. And you can also pick up books in the ISIS series, such as ISIS Wrath of the Cyber Goddess, um, and ISIS Night of the Vampires in paperback and Kindle Unlimited. And you can pick up the latest East Team series book, East Team Undercover, on Amazon in paperback and in Kindle. And you can also pick it up on Smashwords as well. Same thing with Night of the Vampires. And you can also pick up the cornerstone of the SJS Direct universe, The Temptation of John Haynes, in paperback and on Kindle Unlimited. This one you can borrow if you have Amazon Prime. And you can also pick up my newest novel, Spinsterella, which is coming out on Halloween, on Amazon in paperback and on Kindle. Again, that is all I have to say for this video. I'm hoping you go out and learn more about Milestone Media and Milestone Comics. They were some of the best comics ever produced by a black company and black people. And I am sure that you will, once you start reading them, you will love them just as much as I do. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.